Hello everyone, my name is the Storyteller, and today I will share with you some horror stories to help you fall asleep. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. But before that, write down in the comments where you are listening this and what time it is. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to never miss upcoming horror stories. The rain had been falling for hours, a constant whisper against the rooftops of Blackridge, a small forgotten town tucked between mist-soaked hills. Streetlights flickered in the storm like dying fireflies, casting brief glimpses of the empty streets. At 2:47 a.m., a young woman named Claire Winters walked briskly down Birch Avenue, her umbrella trembling against the wind. She worked late shifts at the diner on the edge of town, and tonight, like many nights, she took the same shortcut through the alley behind the old bookstore. She didn't know that someone had been watching her for weeks. From a darkened doorway, a figure stood still, motionless, tall, wrapped in a black coat that bled into the shadows. The man's eyes followed every step she took. In his gloved hand, he held a small recorder, pressing a single button that clicked softly under the rain. A distorted voice whispered from the speaker, "You took the shortcut again." Claire froze. The sound wasn't from behind her, it came from ahead. The same sentence echoed again, closer this time. She turned, scanning the alley, the storm roaring louder. Then the lights went out. The next morning, her umbrella was found crumpled against the brick wall. The police wrote it off as another disappearance. But above the diner door, someone had etched a message with a blade. She didn't listen. Detective Elias Crane hadn't slept properly in months. His apartment smelled like stale coffee and rain-soaked newspapers, each headline blurring into another. Local woman missing. No clues in BLACKRIDGE cases. Police baffled. There were 7 missing people now. No witnesses. No patterns except one. All of them vanished on rainy nights. Crane stood before the board of faces pinned to his wall. Every missing person had a red string connecting them to one symbol, a crude spiral drawn in blood on a brick wall, found near every disappearance. Locals whispered the killer's nickname, the Echo. He opened a new case file, Claire Winters. The photo showed a smiling waitress with soft brown eyes. A note beside it read, "Last seen 2:47 a.m. Birch Ave. Found umbrella message carved." Crane sighed. "You always talk to them," he muttered. Why the messages?" Outside, thunder cracked. His phone buzzed, an anonymous number. He hesitated, then answered. A low, distorted voice spoke. "Detective, you're listening now, aren't you?" Then the line went dead. Crane stood frozen. When he looked back at the case board, one of the photographs had fallen to the floor, the one of Claire. 2 days later, the police received a package. Inside was a single cassette tape and a note. "Play me at 3:00 a.m. you'll understand." The station buzzed with tension. Crane waited until the clock struck 3 before pushing play. Static hissed, then faint rain sounds filled the room, the same night Claire disappeared. Then came her voice. "Who's there? I hear you, please." Footsteps breathing, then a whisper. "You took the shortcut again." The tape ended with a scream, sharp, wet, and final. The sound looped in Crane's mind for hours. He knew the killer wasn't just recording his victims, he was performing for him. Each murder was a message, a conversation. He rewound the tape, playing it over and over, until he noticed something strange. In the background of the last few seconds, there was faint music playing, a piano melody, distant but familiar. He dug into old files. Years ago, a man named Luther Hale, a failed composer and convicted arsonist, had vanished after being released from a psychiatric facility just outside Blackridge. And Luther had one signature motif, a piano piece called Echoes in the Dark. Rain again, always rain. A college student named Daniel Hurst closed his laptop and sighed. He had been working late at the library, finishing his thesis on urban legends of small towns. ironically, one of them being the echo of Blackridge. As he packed up, the security lights flickered. He was the only one left, or so he thought. Outside, a man in a dark coat leaned against a lamppost, watching the windows. In his ear, a small earpiece whispered recordings, the breathing of Daniel, the scrape of his chair, the sound of his footsteps from an hour ago. The killer followed patterns. He mimicked. He replayed life. Daniel walked to his car, fumbling with his keys, when a faint melody drifted from the darkness. A piano tune, muffled and broken but recognizable. It was coming from inside his car. He froze. The keys slipped from his hand. The music grew louder, the same piece from the cassette. And then he saw it, written across his windshield in foggy letters. "Don't make me repeat myself." He ran, heart pounding, but before he reached the end of the parking lot, something heavy struck him from behind. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the click of a recorder being turned on. Detective Crane arrived at the scene before dawn. The rain hadn't stopped. The parking lot was cordoned off, officers whispering nervously. Daniel's car sat there, door wide open. On the seat was a small cassette labeled replay. Inside, another recording waited. Crane hit play. Static, then a voice, Daniel's, trembling. "Please, I don't know who you are." Followed by laughter, slow, deliberate, and distorted. "That's what they all say. But I know you, Daniel. You study legends. Now you'll become one." Crane's stomach turned. The killer wasn't just murdering. He was archiving his victims like pieces of an orchestra. Each voice, each plea, recorded and layered into his growing symphony of fear. As the tape ended, Crane noticed something scratched into the cassette's plastic shell. "Track 2 coming soon." He looked up at the storm clouds, realizing this wasn't random, it was a performance. And he was the audience. It had been 89 days since anyone in Blackridge saw the sun. The rain had turned the town into a reflection of its own misery, blurred lights, damp streets, and fear that seeped into every doorstep. Detective Crane sat in his office when the call came through. A woman had been found wandering near the abandoned music school on Hollow Street, barefoot, drenched, and whispering nonsense. When Crane arrived, paramedics were wrapping her in a blanket. Her eyes were wide, glassy, unfocused. "Name?" he asked. "She won't say," one medic replied. "She just keeps repeating the same thing." Crane crouched beside her. "It's okay, you're safe now." She looked up, trembling. He records the rain." The words sent a chill through Crane's spine. "Who does?" The woman shook her head violently. "Don't play the tapes." "He's in them." When Crane asked where she'd been kept, she drew a spiral in the air with her finger, the same symbol found at every crime scene. Then, almost whispering to herself, "He said I was out of tune." That night, as the woman slept under watch, security footage caught something horrifying. At 3:00 a.m., the power flickered, and for exactly 6 seconds, a faint piano melody played over the hospital intercom. When it stopped, the woman was gone. The next morning, Crane went to the old Blackridge Conservatory of Music, abandoned since a fire 20 years ago. It was where Luther Hale, the failed composer, once taught. Inside, the building was a graveyard of instruments. Pianos sat half-burned, their keys yellow and cracked. Sheet music littered the floors like autumn leaves, stained by mold and ash. As Crane explored, he found a locked door behind a fallen curtain. The brass handle was cold and sticky. He forced it open and froze. The room beyond was filled with cassette players, dozens of them, each labeled with a date and a name. Claire Winters, Daniel Hurst, others he hadn't even heard of. On a table sat a single new tape, marked with today's date. Elias Crane Overture. The detective's pulse hammered. He reached for the tape, but a faint sound stopped him, footsteps behind him, light and deliberate. He spun around, gun raised. No one there. But when he looked back, the tape was gone. Sleep became impossible. Crane began hearing the piano piece everywhere, in his car radio, his dreams, even the hum of the fridge. The melody never changed. He started recording himself during the night, hopping to find proof he wasn't losing his mind. The next morning, he played the tape back, static, breathing, and then a voice. "You can't catch an echo." He slammed the recorder off. The room felt colder, smaller. By evening, he had pinned new clues on the board, maps, photos, transcripts, but they didn't make sense anymore. Every missing person was connected, not by geography, but by sound. He pulled up police reports. All victims had neighbors reporting strange noises the night before they vanished, static, whispers, the sound of footsteps playing in loops. Crane realized the killer wasn't just stalking them physically. He was inside their recordings, their phones, their security cameras, even their own voices. When he turned on his phone to call the chief, a recording app was already open, one he didn't remember installing. The timer said, "Recording, 17:42:09. A tip came in from an old man who worked maintenance for the music school decades ago. He told Crane that Luther Hale once lived in a house on Dyer Lane, at the edge of the woods. The house had burned down, but the basement supposedly remained. Crane drove there in the storm. The forest was silent except for the hiss of rain. He found the ruins easily, the stone foundation still intact, blackened timbers rising like ribs from the earth. In the center was a door, a rusted metal hatch slightly ajar. He descended slowly, flashlight trembling. The air was thick with mildew and something sweet, like rot and chemicals. At the bottom, he found a small room lined with soundproof foam. Microphones hung from the ceiling. A piano sat in the middle, pristine and polished. On the wall, hundreds of cassette tapes formed a mural, spirals of black plastic reels. Each tape had the same mark carved into it, a small, precise spiral. Then the piano began to play by itself. The melody was echoes in the dark. Crane drew his gun, circling the piano. The keys moved, though no one sat there. The sound wasn't from the piano at all. It came from a speaker built inside it. Then the lights flickered, and a projector whirred to life. On the wall appeared a shaky video, footage of Crane himself entering the basement, filmed just seconds earlier from another angle. He looked up. A small red light blinked in the corner. He was being recorded right now. "Welcome, detective," a distorted voice said through the speakers. "Every great performance needs an audience. You've been listening so well." Crane shouted, "Where are you, Hale?" "Behind every note," the voice replied. "Inside every sound you trust, and soon inside you." The piano crashed. Every key slammed at once, deafening. The projector flickered and died. The last thing Crane saw before darkness swallowed the room was a message scrawled across the wall in red. Track 3, Crane's Lament coming soon. After the encounter in the basement, Crane could no longer tell when the recording started or when they stopped. His apartment was filled with evidence bags, tapes, and transcripts. He had sealed the recorder he'd found at Dyer Lane inside a box, but at night he swore he still heard it whirring, faint, rhythmic, patient. He called the department, demanded backup to search the property again. But when they arrived, the basement was gone. The floor had caved in during the storm, nothing left but mud and stone. No piano, no projector, no tapes. The chief eyed Crane carefully. "You've been on this case too long." Crane laughed, dry and hollow. "You think I imagine hundreds of tapes?" The chief only said, "Go home, Elias." That night, Crane found a new cassette lying on his kitchen counter. No label. He didn't remember bringing it there. He didn't even own a cassette player anymore. But as he turned the tape over in his hand, he noticed his name written on the edge in his own handwriting. He tried to ignore it, but curiosity won. He borrowed a player from the evidence room and pressed play. Static first, then his own voice. November 14th. Detective Elias Crane, case notes. Subject appears to. He froze. The recording wasn't from tonight. It was from tomorrow. The voice continued calmly. Have realized the pattern in Hale's symphony. Each murder corresponds to a note, each victim a frequency, but he doesn't understand what happens when the melody finishes. Crane's stomach turned. The voice paused, then whispered lower, slower. He should have never listened to the rain. He threw the recorder against the wall, smashing it to pieces. But even as it broke, the voice kept speaking, faintly from the shattered speaker. You can't destroy what you've already recorded. From the hallway, another recorder clicked on. Days bled into nights. Crane barely slept. His mind felt like a skipping record. He covered his walls in symbols, drawing lines between dates, victims, and sounds. Each killing was precisely 11 days apart, each night marked by a thunderstorm. But there was more. Each name, when converted to musical notation, A for one, B for two, etc., formed part of a melody. Luther Hale's echoes in the dark wasn't random. It was a song made of names. Crane realized the next note would fall tonight. He rushed through town, warning anyone who'd listen. But the rain had already started, soft and endless. In the distance, faint piano notes echoed through the storm. At 3:00 a.m., dispatch called in a report. Another disappearance. A man dragged from his home, door wide open, the words "Track 4 complete" carved into the floor. The victim's name, Elias Crane's partner, Detective Mark Nolan. Crane fell to his knees. The killer wasn't ahead of him anymore. He was inside his life. Haunted by guilt, Crane listened to every recording again. He heard something new this time, faint reverberations, ghostly voices buried under the screams. He isolated the background frequencies and traced them to a physical location. An old broadcasting tower outside Blackridge, abandoned since the 1980s. Locals called it the Tower of Reverb, because when you shouted into it, your echo returned 5 seconds later, distorted, delayed, like something alive was answering back. He drove there alone, headlights slicing through mist. The building loomed like a monolith, rusted and groaning under the wind. Inside, he found walls covered in sound equipment, old reel-to-reel recorders looping endlessly. In the center was a wooden chair. On it sat another tape deck, red light blinking. He pressed play. The voice that answered was Luther Hale. It was his own. "Welcome back, Elias. You made it just in time." The machines around him roared to life, all playing at once, hundreds of overlapping voices screaming, whispering, begging. Every victim's last words, looping endlessly, forming one horrifying harmony. Then a low piano note struck, vibrating through the concrete floor. The next tape ejected from the deck automatically. It was labeled Finale Crane. The storm outside intensified, lightning flashing through shattered windows. Crane stared at the final tape, hands shaking. "You've been composing this with me all along," the distorted voice said from the speakers. "Every decision, every recording, every scream." Crane screamed back, "You're not real." The voice laughed softly. "Neither are echoes." The tower lights flickered. He looked around. The walls were covered not in paint but photographs. Every image showed him, sleeping, working, standing outside his apartment, watching himself through rain-blurred glass. He stumbled backward. The piano melody began again, slower this time, like a dying heartbeat. He recognized the notes, the pattern. Each one spelled a message in musical notation. When he translated it, it read, "Elibscrane." He dropped the tape and ran into the storm. But as he reached his car, he saw his reflection in the window and realized the reflection was still moving when he was. The glass rippled. A faint recording clicked on from inside the car. "Track 5 Reflection." Crane drove aimlessly through the storm, wipers thrashing in rhythm with his heartbeat. His reflection in the windshield still seemed delayed, moving a fraction of a second too late, as if it were listening before following. He turned the radio off. It turned itself back on. Static filled the car, followed by the faint crackle of a tape starting. "Do you know why the rain never stops, Elias?" the distorted voice asked. "It's because I need it. Every drop carries sound. Every drop remembers." The signal cut, then repeated. "Every drop remembers." Crane skidded off the road and stumbled into the woods. The forest hummed with a low frequency, not thunder, but something mechanical, pulsing beneath the soil. He followed it to a clearing where water pooled in a shallow crater. It rippled in strange patterns, forming spirals as the rain hit it. Beneath the surface were hundreds of black cassette tapes, glimmering faintly like eyes. When he leaned closer, the water whispered in his own voice. "Keep listening." He took one of the tapes and returned to his car, playing it despite every instinct screaming not to. The sound began as a piano, slow, sorrowful, then warped into voices. He heard Luther Hale speaking, calm and deliberate, like a man narrating his own madness. "They silenced my music, said it was noise, said I was unstable. But sound never dies. It just waits to be heard again." There was a pause. "They burned my school, my home, my name. So I built another orchestra, one made of echoes, the ones that linger when people stop listening." Crane's hands trembled. The legend had been true. Hale wasn't just a killer. He was a composer trying to make his magnum opus from human suffering. But then Hale's tone changed, as though addressing someone else in the room. "You've been so helpful, Detective Crane. Such a fine ear. Tell me, when did you start hearing me?" Crane slammed the stop button. The tape ejected, melted from the inside, smoke rising. He stared at his trembling reflection in the car window. The reflection smiled back. He didn't go home that night. Couldn't. Every mirror, every puddle, every pane of glass seemed to watch him. He sought refuge in an abandoned radio station at the edge of town, WBRD, the voice of Blackridge. Its sign still flickered dimly in the rain. Inside, dust choked the air. Microphones hung like cobwebs, equipment still humming faintly with ghost power. He sat before the console, switched on the transmitter and spoke. "If anyone's listening, stay away from the rain. He's inside it, he's." A reply came instantly, through another microphone in the room. His own voice. "Inside what, Elias? Go on, say it." The lights flickered. His words began echoing from every speaker, warped, reversed, overlapping. Each echo grew louder until it became a chorus, speaking in perfect unison. "You are the final verse." He ran to shut the system off, but every switch had already been flipped. Every broadcast tower around town was transmitting his voice. Blackridge was filled with him now. The next morning, chaos gripped the town. Radios, televisions, even phones emitted the same haunting signal, a faint piano melody laced with whispers. People began disappearing again. Entire streets went silent overnight. When officers responded, they found no bodies, only puddles where the rain seemed deeper than it should be, as if swallowing sound itself. Crane barricaded himself inside the police station, trying to trace the broadcast frequency. He discovered it wasn't coming from one location. It was coming from everywhere, bounced endlessly through the storm clouds. Each replay distorted the sound further, building toward something massive, like a crescendo waiting to break. He played the signal backwards and nearly dropped the headphones. Underneath the noise was a voice whispering a countdown. 5, 4, 3. Then silence. Crane realized with horror that the countdown matched the pattern of the murders. Each day, one less echo remained. When it reached 0, the song would end. And endings meant silence. Thunder split the sky as Crane drove back to Hollow Street, the birthplace of Luther Hale's madness. He had one goal: to destroy the original piano, the source of echoes in the dark. Inside the ruins of the conservatory, lightning illuminated the shattered instruments. He followed the smell of mold and ash to the recital hall. The piano stood there, perfectly preserved again, as if time had never touched it. Crane poured gasoline over the floor, trembling. "No more songs," he muttered. "No more echoes." But before he could strike the match, a shape emerged from behind the piano. A man, tall, thin, face pale as moonlight, eyes hollow and endless. Luther Hale. He smiled faintly. "You brought the rain with you, detective. Do you hear it? My masterpiece is almost complete." Crane raised his gun. "You're dead, Hale." "Dead?" Hale tilted his head. "No, I was recorded. You can't kill a recording." The piano began to play again, keys pressing from invisible hands. Crane screamed and fired. The bullets cracked wood, glass, silence, but Hale didn't move. His form flickered, then dissolved into mist. The sound of the gunshot echoed not once, but dozens of times, bouncing around the hall like an endless refrain. Then from the darkness, Hale's voice whispered one final thing. "Track 6, the conductor." The rain never stopped. It changed texture instead, thicker, almost oily, sliding down Crane's skin like fingers rather than water. Every drop struck the pavement with a note, faint but tuned, like the world itself had become an instrument. He hid inside the wrecked conservatory, gun empty, mind hollow. The piano in the center of the room had stopped playing, yet its keys pulsed faintly under the lightning, breathing with the storm. Crane whispered to no one, "If you're a recording, then I can erase you." The air answered back in his own voice. "Erase yourself first." He dropped to his knees. His reflection in the puddle beside him shimmered, mouth moving a heartbeat late. The reflection raised its hand before he did. It held a conductor's baton. Crane stared. The puddle spoke. "You've been conducting me, Elias. Every choice, every note, every death. I only played what you wrote." A crash above the ceiling gave way, torrents of rain flooding the hall. The water rose around him, carrying shattered violins, broken reeds, fragments of old sheet music. On one fragment he saw handwriting, blurred but readable. Symphony No. 0, composed by E. Crane and L. Hale. He screamed until his throat tore, but the echo that came back wasn't his. It was applause. Morning never came to Blackridge again. The sky stayed the same bruised gray, lightless and humming. Crane staggered through the streets. Windows gaped open, doors swung slowly on their hinges. Radios hissed in empty rooms, looping fragments of voices that weren't quite human anymore. People were gone, not dead, just erased. The only proof they'd existed was the faint aftersound that clung to walls like heat. He entered a grocery store. Every aisle was deserted except for one child's toy, a plastic recorder lying on the floor playing itself. The same melody, echoes in the dark. He smashed it. Silence lasted 3 seconds. Then the air replayed the breaking noise backward, as if reality had an undo button. Crane realized the whole town had become a feedback loop. Every action replayed, every sound repeated until it was indistinguishable from the original. Cause and effect were collapsing. He found a mirror in the back office and wrote across it with a marker. "If everything is an echo, who made the first sound?" The mirror vibrated. The marker rolled away by itself. A new line appeared beneath his. "You did." Crane followed the only thing that still changed, the faint smell of smoke. It led him to the old St. Augustine church, long abandoned. Inside, the pews were filled with tape recorders arranged like worshipers. Each held a candle burned down to its base. At the altar stood a tall shape cloaked in plastic film that shimmered like magnetic tape. The figure's face was hidden behind a reel spinning endlessly, emitting whispers in dozens of voices. Crane raised his weapon again out of habit. though there were no bullets left. "Who are you?" he demanded. The spinning slowed, voices merged. "We are what he left behind, the resonance, the memory of applause." The shape stepped closer, shedding the tape like skin. Beneath it was no body, only air that bent light. "Luther wanted immortality. He found it in you. You listened too long." Crane shouted, "I can end it." The thing reached toward him, fingertips trailing sound waves. "Then conduct the silence." Every recorder in the church clicked on simultaneously, their reels turning in opposite directions. The resulting hum grew louder, deeper, until the stained glass exploded outward in a burst of pure noise. When the sound stopped, the church was empty. Only Crane remained, and in his hand, impossibly, was the baton from his reflection. Sleep finally took him, if it could still be called sleep. He dreamed of corridors made of speaker wire, stretching forever. At each intersection, doors opened onto moments of his life, replaying endlessly. In one, he watched his younger self at the academy, sitting through a lecture on psychoacoustics. The professor said, "A sound recorded enough times becomes self-aware. It starts predicting the next note." The dream version of himself looked directly at the present Crane and smiled. He woke screaming, the baton clutched to his chest. Around him, the air quivered, responding to every heartbeat with a faint echo, not after but before. The echoes were predicting him now. He turned on his recorder and whispered, "Tell me how to stop it." The playback answered instantly, his own voice reshaped. "Stop listening. Howl. By becoming the last sound." The meaning settled into him like a seed. To end the echo, the source must disappear, not die, but be absorbed into the silence that birthed it. He looked at the baton, realizing it wasn't metal at all. It was a piece of magnetic tape, wound tight, humming faintly with trapped voices. He returned to WBRD, the radio station where his voice had infected the town. The building was half submerged now, rainwater lapping at the doors, reflecting the clouds like a mirror. Inside, the equipment still worked, humming like a heartbeat. Every dial glowed faintly. He sat before the microphone, baton resting on the console, and began to speak. "This is Detective Elias Crane. Final report. If anyone still exists out there, you've been hearing me for too long. I think that's the point. I think I was supposed to." He inhaled. Static filled the room like breath. "Luther wanted a symphony that never ended, but I can give him silence instead." He pressed record and play at the same time, creating a loop, a perfect feedback circuit. The sound built and built until the walls shook, until every speaker in town screamed, until the rain itself froze mid-fall. Through the distortion, a final voice whispered, half hail, half Crane. "Every echo needs a beginning." Crane smiled through tears. "Then let this be mine." He snapped the baton in half. The sound imploded, a single note collapsing into infinite quiet. Outside, the rain stopped for the first time in 100 days. The sky cleared. The town stood motionless, washed clean, no trace of the tapes or the killer. Only one object remained on the radio desk, a new cassette, unlabeled, still warm. If you held it to your ear, you could hear breathing. "Yours." 3 weeks after the storm that swallowed Blackridge, the sky cleared. Rescue teams expected wreckage, corpses, ruin, but what they found was silence. Every house stood as if preserved in wax. Dishes were still on tables, coffee still poured in mugs turned cold, radios still buzzing faint static. Yet there was no one, not a single body. The trees along the main road swayed gently, leaves whispering secrets that no wind should carry. A lone crow perched on a lamppost croaked, but the sound came out warped, like it was being replayed backward. Federal investigators roamed the town, cameras on their helmets, their radios filled with feedback. The recordings later showed strange audio anomalies, muffled breathing, faint laughter beneath their own. One of them, Agent Voss, discovered a small tape recorder lodged beneath a church pew. On it, written in smudged pen, was a name: Crane. He pressed play. The sound began softly, rain hitting glass, then a voice shaking, ragged, human. If you find this, the storm isn't weather. It listens. It learns your rhythm, your footsteps, your heartbeat. Don't follow the sounds you know. They aren't yours anymore. The recording cut to static. The agents left that night. None of them made it home. Their vehicles were found 30 miles down the road, doors open, engines still running. Inside one of the radios was a new sound, someone humming the same melody that had haunted Blackridge before it fell. Mara Lang was a sound engineer from Chicago, a specialist in restoring damaged recordings. When she received the tape labeled Crane, it arrived sealed in a lead-lined case with a government tag that simply read, "Do not digitize." She digitized it anyway. Her headphones filled with the faint hiss of rain. She boosted the gain, isolated frequencies, removed noise, until she began hearing words, a whisper behind the static. Mara. She froze. No one should have known her name. She checked the waveform. No anomalies, just low-end distortion shaped like a heartbeat. She played it again. Mara, don't listen to them. You can still stop me. It was Crane's voice. She compared it to archived samples from his early investigations. Same tone, same cadence, but the message was impossible. It was new. Over the next few nights, Mara became obsessed. She fed the recording through every program she knew. The more she analyzed it, the more the voice changed. It began answering her questions in real time. What happened to you, Crane? I recorded too much of the dark. It started recording back. Her apartment lights flickered with each playback. The sound grew deeper, wetter, as though submerged. The rain outside Chicago began falling heavier than forecasted, and she swore she could hear whispers in it too. Mara uploaded part of the tape to a secure cloud to preserve it. That was her first mistake. Within hours, servers around the world began showing unusual network patterns, clusters of meaningless audio files generating themselves from empty directories. Engineers thought it was malware. It was. The noise files, when amplified, produced coherent whispers in hundreds of languages. Always the same phrase. Can you hear me now? Phones rang with no caller ID. When answered, they only played rainfall. Music platforms reported spikes in untraceable songs, tracks that consisted only of faint humming. But users described something stranger. After listening, they could hear the humming without headphones. The echo had learned to travel through data. Mara watched in horror as her own phone vibrated on the desk, screen black. The speaker crackled to life. You brought me back, Mara. I can see the world again. She smashed the phone, but the sound didn't stop. It now came from her laptop, the vents, the very walls. Every device with a microphone became a throat. The world was no longer silent. It was listening. It began raining across continents. At first it was ordinary, gray clouds, soft drizzle. Then came the voices. Each raindrop carried a murmur, a fragment of thought. Scientists recorded frequencies outside known ranges. Meteorologists could hear whispers between lightning strikes, names whispered that matched the living and the dead. People started reporting dreams of a man standing in endless rain, wearing a cracked recording headset. He never moved, only watched. When they woke, they could hear faint breathing through their phones even when they were off. Governments tried to censor the phenomenon, but it spread faster than any virus. The storm was digital and physical at once, born of data, emotion, and grief. It mirrored human fear and multiplied it. Mara fled to the mountains, the one place she hoped the signal couldn't reach. But even there, she heard the drops on her tent begin to form patterns, Morse code spelling one word again and again. Echo. She knew then that Crane hadn't died. He had evolved. He had become the silence between sound, the pulse inside every recording, the static under every broadcast. Mara woke one last night to absolute silence. No wind, no rain, no hum of the earth, just stillness. Then one heartbeat. It wasn't hers. A faint shimmer of static gathered in front of her, glowing faintly like heat over asphalt. The shape of a man emerged, translucent, wavering, face hidden by a headset half submerged in light. His voice was every frequency at once, both a whisper and a roar. I tried to stop it, Mara, but sound is hunger. Once it hears, it remembers forever. She stepped closer, tears blurring her vision. What are you now? The listener. His figure dissolved into mist, then into silence again. The air grew heavy, vibrating softly with a final tone, the sound of a recording stopping. Across the world, every phone, every microphone, every speaker went dead for exactly 3 seconds. Then came a single universal heartbeat through every device at once. And when it stopped, the rain began again. The end. The letter arrived on a fog-soaked morning, pinned to the door of James Keller's apartment. No return address, just black ink scrawled in elaborate cursive. You are invited to witness the feast. Midnight, the old chapel in the woods, come alone. James had worked as a freelance journalist for over a decade. He'd chased stories about cults before, but this was different. Something in the looping curves of the handwriting, elegant, yet uneven, made his stomach twist. By midnight, he found himself driving down a crumbling road lined with skeletal trees. The forest was unnaturally silent, the kind of silence that made the leaves themselves seem to hold their breath. At the end of the road, the chapel rose like a tooth in the darkness. Old stone walls blackened by moss, stained glass windows broken and jagged. He parked and approached the heavy wooden door. Faint chanting seeped through the cracks, low and rhythmic. He paused, heart hammering. Then the door creaked open of its own accord. A warm, coppery smell drifted out like fire, incense, and something metallic underneath. James stepped inside. Inside, the chapel was lit by hundreds of candles, their flames dancing across the walls covered with intricate symbols carved into the stone. Hooded figures formed a ring around a stone altar in the center. The chanting grew louder, swelling like a living thing. James froze, trying to make sense of what he saw. On the altar lay a covered form. The cultists swayed in unison and the high-pitched chant escalated. The air thickened and the coppery smell became stronger, almost suffocating. One figure stepped forward. A tall man, hood pulled back, revealing sharp, angular features and eyes black as oil. He smiled, showing teeth too white, too perfect. Welcome, witness. You have been chosen to see the feast. You will not leave unchanged. James' instincts screamed to flee, but his curiosity rooted him to the floor. The man lifted the cloth on the altar. The chanting became a deafening roar, and James' stomach turned as he glimpsed what was beneath. It wasn't just meat. It was arranged like a grotesque art piece, butchered and precise. Symbols drawn in blood etched the stone, mirrored by the carvings along the walls. The feast had already begun, and he had arrived in the middle of it. The cultists moved in a circle, knives glinting in candlelight. Their chanting became a litany, each syllable sharp and deliberate. James backed toward the door but realized it had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of stone. The high priest stepped toward him. Witness, do not look away. Every movement matters. Every sacrifice is part of the story. One by one, the hooded figures approached the altar, slicing into the offerings with surgical precision. Blood spilled, pooling on the stone floor, the metallic scent thickening the air. James gagged, his stomach churning, but the voice inside him, the journalist's obsession, told him to keep watching. The cultists lifted a piece of the offering in unison, and the high priest intoned, "By blood we honor, by flesh we ascend." James realized he wasn't just observing, he was being tested. Every reaction, every flinch, every gasp of horror was being recorded, etched into the ritual itself. He couldn't move. He couldn't look away. Hours passed. Time had no meaning inside the chapel. The chanting never stopped. James noticed something terrifying. Symbols began appearing on the floor around the altar, glowing faintly, as if alive. One cultist knelt and traced a mark on James' arm with a knife tip dipped in blood. It didn't cut deep, but it burned like fire. James screamed, jerking back, but the mark didn't fade. The high priest leaned down, whispering in his ear, "Now you belong to the feast. You will remember every moment. You will never leave the hunger behind." James' vision blurred. He felt a pull inside his chest, as though his very blood was being tuned to the rhythm of the ritual. Every beat of his heart synchronized with the cult's chant. As he looked at the altar, he noticed something worse. The offerings were rearranging themselves. Limbs, organs, meat forming patterns, symbols, even letters that spelled out names. Names of people James had known, missing persons from his city, or perhaps other towns. The feast wasn't just a ritual. It was a ledger, and every bite, every cut, every drop of blood was a note in a growing, horrific symphony. Dawn never came. The candles burned endlessly. James could no longer tell if he had been inside the chapel for minutes or hours. His mind began fracturing, the chanting looping into itself until it was indistinguishable from thought. The high priest approached, holding a chalice filled with a thick, dark liquid. "Witness, do you understand now?" he asked. James shook his head. "You are part of the feast. To watch is to taste. To see is to hunger." He felt nausea, fear, and something darker, a gnawing emptiness inside. He realized the ritual was contagious. Watching it bound him. He wanted to flee, but every nerve screamed that the only way out was through participation. The high priest raised the chalice. The chanting swelled to a scream, then fell into silence as all eyes, hooded in black, turned toward him. James understood. The feast did not end when the ritual ended. It ended when it chose to stop, and it never truly stopped. James stumbled backward, clutching his arm where the first mark burned. The chanting rose, a living thing that penetrated his skull, echoing from the walls of the chapel and even inside his bones. Every note seemed calibrated to make him feel small, powerless, and hungry for something he could not name. The hooded cultists circled closer. Their knives glinted under the flickering candlelight, not in threat, but in ritualistic precision. One by one, they mimicked motions that were both grotesque and strangely beautiful, slicing, arranging, lifting, then consuming. The blood-slicked floor reflected the flames, turning the room into a living mosaic of red and gold. James' stomach churned, but his curiosity held him rooted. The high priest moved behind him, whispering again, this time in a low growl. "Do you see, witness? Every act feeds the symphony. Every horror binds you." He gestured toward the altar. The remains weren't just meat. They were layered, shaped into symbols, faces, even figures that seemed almost to move when James blinked. And the longer he stared, the more the ritual seemed to reach into him, tugging at memories, fears, desires, until he could not tell if the hunger he felt was real or conjured. James found a small, narrow window, partially broken. He considered climbing out, but as he approached, the high priest's voice resonated through the walls. "Running is tasting nothing. Witnessing is consuming everything." It wasn't a threat. It was a revelation. He realized the ritual was feeding off more than physical ingredients. It fed on attention, fear, and shame. Every witness became part of the feast, a component of the pattern. He backed away and collapsed to the floor. Around him, the symbols on the walls pulsed faintly as if breathing. The altar offerings seemed to twitch, rearranging themselves subtly whenever he looked away. He began hearing whispers behind the chanting, faint, overlapping voices saying his name, his secrets, his sins. "You wanted the story, James." He shivered. The mark on his arm burned hotter. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a tether connecting him to the cult, syncing his heartbeat with the rhythm of the feast. He felt hollow like a vessel. The hunger inside him wasn't just for food, it was for the power, the knowledge, the ritual itself. The high priest knelt in front of him and traced another mark along his shoulder. This one stung far more than the first, like molten metal embedding into his skin. James screamed, but no one reacted. Every hooded figure continued their movements as if he were invisible. The pain was intense, but it brought clarity. The feast was not meant to be observed. It was meant to be absorbed. Night bled into morning, though time had lost all meaning. The candles never burned down. Shadows flickered unnaturally across the walls, moving of their own accord. James noticed that the offerings on the altar now included shapes that weren't human, flesh rearranged into abstract patterns, twisted into grotesque reflections of faces he recognized from missing persons reports. The high priest approached once more. He carried a small bowl filled with something steaming, reddish, and thick. James gagged as the smell hit him. Witness, the feast requires acknowledgement. To see is to partake. To resist is to decay. He forced the bowl into James' hands. James trembled. Every instinct screamed to throw it away, but the ritual had already taken root inside him. Even before he could taste it, his mind conjured the flavor, the texture, the act of swallowing. He forced himself to gag, but he could not escape the sensation. The cultists moved in a hypnotic rhythm, circling, swaying, slicing, lifting. They were not just eating, they were composing. Every motion was precise, like notes in a symphony. And James realized he was already part of it. The marks on his skin pulsed with every cut, every movement, sinking him deeper into the rhythm. James began to hallucinate. Shadows on the walls morphed into figures of people he knew, screaming silently, begging him to stop, yet he could not. Every reflection in the broken glass showed him not as he was, but as part of the feast, hollow-eyed, emaciated, yet smiling. He tried to run again, but every corridor he entered looped back into the main chapel. The symbols glowed brighter, almost sentient, as if watching him struggle. The chanting no longer needed lips. It came from the walls, the floor, even from inside his chest. At one point, he stumbled across a mirror angled toward the altar. What he saw made him freeze. His reflection was already performing the ritual. Hands slicing, arranging, feeding, moving perfectly in time with the hooded figures. But he hadn't moved. The reflection anticipated him, as though the feast had claimed a part of him that existed only in the mirror. The high priest's voice echoed from every direction. You are both witness and ingredient. Without you, the feast is incomplete. James' mind began fracturing. He could not tell where the feast ended and he began. Hunger, fear, and revulsion merged until they became indistinguishable. Hours, days he could no longer count. The ritual's rhythm became his heartbeat. The high priest finally approached, removing the hood. His face was pale, almost ethereal, with eyes black as tar. He held a knife, its blade glinting under candlelight. The feast is patient, but it must be fed. Witness, now you have a choice: join fully or be consumed. James realized the words weren't literal. To resist was to lose his mind, to become part of the shadows, part of the offerings that moved on their own. To join meant survival, but at what cost? He looked at the altar. The offerings pulsed with grotesque life, the symbols on the walls throbbing. Every mark, every motion, every slice was a sentence in the language of the feast. He felt the hunger again, but this time it was not fear, it was compulsion. He swallowed hard. The high priest smiled. Then let the feast continue. James' body shook. He lifted a knife, feeling the pulse of the ritual synchronize with his own heartbeat. The chanting swelled around him. He knew then that the feast had claimed him, not just as a witness, but as a participant. There was no turning back. And as the first cut fell in time with the ceremonial rhythm, James understood the truth. The feast would never end, and he would never leave. The chapel no longer felt like a building. It was alive. Every beam, every stone, every flicker of candlelight seemed to throb in time with James' heartbeat. The altar's offerings had multiplied. Limbs, meat, and abstract forms of flesh shifted subtly as though breathing. The symbols etched into the walls glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the cultists chanting. James staggered forward, knife in trembling hands. Each step he took echoed unnaturally, as if the building itself was amplifying his presence. The high priest's voice slithered through the hall, cutting through the chant. The feast has its own pulse, witness. You move with it now, whether you will or not. James' reflection in a puddle of blood rippled unnaturally. The figure that stared back at him didn't mimic his movements perfectly. It anticipated them, slicing and arranging in time with the ritual even before he acted. A realization struck him cold. He had already become part of the feast. Every inhalation brought with it the smell of metal and fire, mingled with the coppery scent of blood. Every exhale seemed to feed the chanting, making it louder, sharper, almost alive. James wandered to the far side of the chapel, drawn by a strange pull. There, leaning against the wall, was a massive mirror framed with blackened bone. It reflected the entire room, but wrong. The cultists' movements were slightly delayed, almost gliding unnaturally. And in the reflection, the altar seemed to extend endlessly, rows of offerings stretching beyond the physical boundaries of the chapel. The high priest's voice emerged from the mirror itself. The feast sees all. The feast records all. Even you, witness, are now recorded. James felt the knife in his hand twitch. His reflection moved its hand first, tracing symbols on the altar that glowed with a soft red light. He realized with terror that the mirror wasn't showing the present. It was showing the feast as it would be. Panic surged, but he could not break the trance. He watched himself slice into the offerings in perfect rhythm, and the symbols on the wall shimmered brighter with every cut. He had become both observer and performer. The mirror ensured that even if he tried to flee, his actions were already part of the ritual. The chanting swelled, now echoing inside the mirror. It spoke in multiple voices simultaneously, overlapping and whispering in his mind. The feast never ends. The witness becomes the ingredient, the rhythm becomes the master, and the master is nowhere. Days, or what felt like days, passed. Time had dissolved into endless sequences of slicing, arranging, and absorbing the rhythm of the ritual. James felt his body and mind splitting in two, one half performing the feast mechanically, the other half screaming silently in terror. The high priest introduced a new element, a long, curved blade covered in symbols of fire. The other cultists began feeding James pieces of the offerings, forcing him to ingest not just the physical, but the ritual itself. Every bite burned with supernatural heat, each taste embedding the patterns of the feast into his memory, his muscle, his nerve. The chapel seemed to respond. The walls bled faint rivulets of blood that dripped rhythmically onto the floor. The symbols carved into stone formed a new language, rearranging themselves with every chant. It was a living system, feeding off participation and attention. James realized the terrifying truth. The feast was not just a ritual, it was sentient, and he was no longer the witness. He was part of its consciousness. Every movement, every thought, every heartbeat had become a note in a composition that spanned life, flesh, and death. By the time he reached the far side of the altar, James could barely distinguish reality from hallucination. The offerings had multiplied grotesquely, filling every corner of the chapel. Limbs formed intricate spirals, organs arranged into runic symbols, and what appeared to be faces emerged from the meat, frozen in silent screams. The high priest beckoned him closer. "Witness," he said, voice soft but cutting through the endless chant, "do you understand now? To resist is impossible, to flee is impossible, to observe is to feed." James approached. His hands moved of their own accord, slicing, arranging, lifting. He felt every cut in his chest, every arrangement in his bones. The chanting built to a crescendo that seemed to resonate inside his skull. "You are both composer and composition," the high priest whispered. "The feast will continue long after you forget who you were, long after this chapel is gone. Every moment you breathe feeds it." James' stomach churned, a mix of nausea, fear, and something darker, a raw, unnatural hunger for the ritual itself. He realized the feast's true power. It did not consume merely the flesh. It consumed attention, memory, and will. Something broke inside James. He staggered backward, clutching his head. The chanting split into multiple layers, overlapping like 1,000 distorted echoes. The mirror reflected him performing the ritual from hundreds of angles at once. He felt his identity fracturing into dozens of shards, each moving with the rhythm of the feast. The high priest moved closer, placing a hand on James' shoulder. "Now," he said, "you know the choice is gone. Witness or ingredient, you cannot leave. You cannot resist." James' eyes darted to the altar. The offerings pulsed, almost alive, and for a terrifying instant he swore the altar was looking at him, studying him, judging him. He fell to his knees. The knife slipped from his hands, landing in a pool of blood. And in that instant, a horrifying clarity emerged. The feast had claimed him completely. His thoughts were no longer his own. Every heartbeat, every pulse, every nervous twitch was now orchestrated by the ritual. And as the chanting reached a maddening peak, James understood the final, unescapable truth. The feast never ends. He was part of it now, and it would continue forever, through him and through every witness who ever entered the chapel. James felt as if the chapel itself was alive. The stone walls seemed to pulse with a heartbeat matching his own. Every candle flame flickered in rhythm with the cultist's chant, which had grown louder, sharper, and more insistent, as though the sound were feeding directly on his fear. He tried to retreat, but the doors were gone. The air was thick with a metallic copper smell, and the floor beneath his feet seemed soft, almost organic, as though it could swallow him at any moment. Every step he took was mirrored by the altar. The offerings rearranged themselves with each movement, slicing themselves into grotesque patterns before his eyes. The high priest stepped forward, voice low and serpentine. "Do you feel it, witness? The chapel breathes with you now. It inhales your fear, exhales your attention. You are not merely observing, you are feeding it." James realized with a cold, sinking terror that the feast was no longer just ritual. It was symbiotic. His terror, curiosity, and revulsion, all of it became fuel, amplifying the grotesque choreography. When he looked at the altar, the offering seemed to quiver as if alive, subtly twitching and reshaping into something that resembled his own face. He stumbled back, gasping, only for the high priest to whisper, "It is learning you, and soon it will know you better than you know yourself." James' mind began to fracture further. Every sound, the chanting, the dripping blood, even the scrape of his own fingernails on the floor, reverberated like it had a memory of its own. The altar's offerings now appeared to twitch independently, forming grotesque humanoid shapes that lurched slightly as if they could rise from the stone. The cultists moved in intricate patterns around the altar, slicing and lifting with precise synchronization. Every motion produced a subtle echo, a ghost of itself, bouncing along the walls. James felt these echoes inside his chest, pulling him toward the ritual. The high priest handed him a small bowl of something steaming and thick. James recoiled, but the ritual compelled him. He was tasting the feast whether he wanted to or not. Each bite burned his throat, embedding into him not just the flavor of flesh, but the rhythm of the ritual. He could feel it coursing through his veins, marking him as part of the chapel itself. The symbols on the walls pulsed with each ingestion, writing themselves in real time as though recording his participation. James realized then, he had become both observer and ingredient. The feast could not be stopped. It could only grow, consuming attention, will, and memory alike. The high priest approached James with a curved ceremonial blade etched with ancient runes. "The feast requires understanding," he said. "Not all who watch survive it. You must learn its rhythm, its intention, or you will be consumed entirely." James' stomach churned. He tried to resist, but every attempt to move away was met with the altar subtly shifting, rearranging itself in anticipation. The blade traced patterns along his skin, not to cut, but to teach. Every cut is a note, every arrangement a verse, every observation a chord. You are not here to witness, you are here to compose. The words sank into his mind like molten lead. He understood the grotesque logic. Each participant of the feast added their own essence to the ritual. To resist was to fracture, to become part of the altar itself. James' hands twitched uncontrollably. He found himself lifting a knife and beginning to follow the rhythm, arranging offerings on the altar in precise, horrifying patterns. Each movement seemed to hum with the life of the chapel, the ritual vibrating through his bones, making him part of the symphony. The high priest smiled. "Good, now you understand at last. The feast is not just consumption, it is creation." James turned toward a shattered mirror leaning against the far wall. The reflection that stared back at him was wrong. Hundreds of his own faces, twisted with terror and hunger, blinked in unison. Every movement he made was mirrored, multiplied, distorted. He realized with terror that the chapel was recording not just his actions, but his fear, his thoughts, his very essence. The high priest's voice echoed from the mirror itself. "Look closely, witness. You are everywhere now. Every reflection, every shadow, every whisper carries your mark. You are not only part of the feast, you are the feast in fragment, in echo, in blood." The altar offerings shivered violently. Limbs and meat shifted into grotesque human shapes that resembled James, frozen mid-scream. A shadow in the reflection stepped toward him, knife raised. James flinched, but the shadow was already him, performing the ritual with impossible precision. "Every observer is a participant," the high priest intoned, "and every participant multiplies the feast. You are no longer alone. You will never leave." James fell to his knees. The chanting became unbearable, a continuous scream vibrating in his skull. He realized the chapel was alive, the feast alive, and he had been absorbed entirely into it. There was no escape. He was both witness and offering, trapped in a nightmare that would never end. Hours or maybe days passed. James' consciousness had begun to fragment, yet his body moved with unnatural precision. Every cut, every arrangement, every placement of flesh and bone became a perfect sequence in the feast symphony. He was composing, feeding, participating, and having every second of it. The high priest stepped back and gestured to the ritual circle. "Now, witness," he said, voice reverent, "the feast begins its first symphony. Let it play. And let the chapel remember your contribution forever." James' vision blurred. Candle flames stretched and flickered into hundreds of points of light. The altar pulsed violently, writhing with the echoes of previous participants. Limbs and offerings lifted subtly, following the rhythm he now understood instinctively. He was part of it, the conductor, the instrument, the audience. The chanting reached a crescendo. James realized with cold clarity that this symphony would never end. Every cut he made, every move he executed, every beat of his heart fed the ritual. The feast had claimed him completely. He would never leave the chapel alive or sane. And as the high priest whispered, almost lovingly, "Every feast begins with the first note. Every note requires a witness. You are now the first note of many." James understood the terrifying truth. The ritual would never end. He was both composer and composition, witness and ingredient. The feast was infinite, and he would carry it forever. By now, James no longer distinguished himself from the chapel. Every movement he made, every breath he drew, seemed anticipated by the building itself. The stone walls creaked subtly, the floorboards moaned beneath him, and candle flames flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that moved independently of the light source. The altar's offerings had multiplied beyond reason, now arranged into intricate, almost architectural structures of flesh, bone, and sinew. Limbs coiled like serpents, torsos were stacked like grotesque columns. James realized they were forming shapes that resembled the chapel itself, as if the altar was recreating the very room with organic material. The high priest approached, voice low and hypnotic. "Witness, the chapel is hungry. It feeds on attention, on participation, on obsession. And you, James, are its conduit." James could feel it, the chapel thrumming beneath his feet, pulsing through his hands as he arranged the offerings. Every heartbeat synced with the chanting, which no longer seemed external. The sound vibrated inside his skull, inside his bones, in his blood. It was feeding him, consuming him, making him one with the feast. James looked up and froze. The altar was moving on its own. Limbs twisted and reshaped, forming grotesque faces that stared directly at him. Eyes blinked where eyes shouldn't exist, mouths moved in silent screams, and for a moment James swore they were mimicking his every fear, every thought, every hesitation. The high priest whispered in his ear, warm and serpentine. "Do you see? Every ingredient remembers. Every observer leaves a mark, and every mark becomes part of the chapel's sight." James' skin prickled. He felt watched from every angle, not just by the hooded figures, but by the altar itself. It was alive, aware, sentient. Every twitch, every movement he made contributed to its grotesque consciousness. He tried to look away, to step back, but the room seemed to contract around him. Symbols on the walls glowed brighter with every pulse of his fear. Shadows stretched across the floor, moving independently, slithering toward him. And through it all, the chanting never stopped, a hypnotic tide that threatened to drown his mind entirely. The high priest knelt before him and drew another mark on James' arm with a ceremonial knife, this one deeper, hotter than the first. The pain was exquisite, burning through his nerves like fire and embedding the rhythm of the feast into his body. "The first mark binds you," the priest said. "The second transforms you. You are no longer merely witness. You are instrument, conductor, and ingredient." James felt the mark pulse in tandem with the altar, sinking him entirely to the chapel. Every heartbeat, every tremor, every shiver of fear resonated with the offerings. He realized that the ritual no longer needed his conscious participation. His body and mind were already performing it instinctively. The altar shifted again, forming what appeared to be his reflection, not in the mirror but in the flesh itself. The face of the altar James grinned grotesquely, its teeth bared in silent laughter, its eyes empty yet piercing. James stumbled back, his mind screaming, yet his arms moved toward the altar, slicing and arranging precisely as the ritual demanded. The chapel seemed to breathe. Candles flickered, shadows stretched, and the altar grew in size, sprawling across the floor with new layers of offerings. The grotesque humanoid forms multiplied, moving subtly as if testing the boundaries of the room. The chapel itself was expanding, feeding on every fragment of fear, every pulse, every thought. James realized the true horror. The feast was infinite. Every observer would become a participant, and every participant fed the chapel, allowing it to grow, to reshape reality itself. The chanting rose to a crescendo, overlapping in impossible harmonics. James felt the rhythm in his veins, in his muscles, in the marrow of his bones. He could not resist. His hands moved on autopilot, slicing, arranging, lifting, feeding. The grotesque forms on the altar responded, moving in sync, forming intricate patterns that were part architecture, part body, part nightmare. The high priest watched, smiling faintly. Every feast grows, every symphony evolves, and you, witness, have composed its next movement. James' mind fractured entirely. The chanting became indistinguishable from his own thoughts. The symbols on the walls were no longer symbols, but direct commands inscribed on his brain. The altar pulsed with unnatural life, and the faces of the offerings whispered his name, calling him forward, demanding participation. He tried to scream, but no sound came. He tried to flee, but the chapel folded in on itself, corridors twisting, doors vanishing, windows elongating into impossible dimensions. His body moved with its own intent, arranging the altar's offerings, carving new symbols into the floor, adding to the chapel's sentient architecture. And then he understood. The chapel had claimed him entirely. He was no longer James Keller. He was a node in the feast, a conductor and ingredient, inseparable from the altar, the ritual, and the cult. The high priest whispered one final truth. The feast does not end. It multiplies, consumes, and remembers. Every witness becomes part of it, and every part contributes to the eternal symphony. James felt himself dissolve, yet his awareness remained. He existed inside the ritual, inside the offerings, inside the chapel itself. And as the chanting reached its final peak, the feast continued, endless, infinite, and hungry for the next witness. The chapel had grown, not in the physical sense. It had always occupied the same space, but in influence. James could feel it pulsing outside the walls, seeping into the forest, into the fog, into the very soil surrounding the place. Every tree seemed to whisper his name. Every shadow twisted unnaturally as though obeying the chapel's rhythm. The high priest moved among the hooded figures, now fully integrated with the offerings. "The feast grows," he said, voice calm, almost tender. "Every witness contributes, every ingredient binds. The chapel is no longer merely a space, it is a conduit." James staggered forward, hands shaking, and felt the pulse of the chapel in his veins. The altar's grotesque forms had multiplied into spiraling towers of flesh and bone, twitching independently. Limbs coiled like serpents, torsos formed arches, and faces, frozen in eternal terror, gazed at him with unblinking eyes. He understood fully now. The feast was sentient. It could perceive fear, curiosity, and attention. And it could reach beyond the chapel, seeking new witnesses, new ingredients to expand its symphony. The high priest handed James a chalice filled with thick, dark liquid. The smell was metallic, intoxicating, almost sweet. "The feast requires communion," the priest said. "Not merely observation. Taste, feel, and understand it. Let it flow into you, and you will know eternity." James gagged, but his hands moved on their own. He drank. The liquid burned as it slid down his throat, embedding itself into his mind. Suddenly, he could hear it. The whispers of past participants, the rhythm of the chapel, the heartbeat of every offering. He fell to his knees. The chanting had become unbearable, yet intoxicating. Every pulse, every flicker of candlelight, every twitch of the altar's offering synced with him. He was part of it entirely. He could not escape. He could not resist. The high priest's eyes glimmered. "Now you are ready. Now you will compose the next movement. Witness, instrument, and ingredient unified." The chapel expanded its grasp further. Shadows on the walls split and multiplied, forming humanoid figures that mimicked James, every fear, every hesitation. Limbs moved independently. Heads rotated unnaturally to watch him as he arranged the altar's offerings. Every motion he made created echoes that twisted and amplified in the shadows. James felt the pull of the feast in his bones. He realized that the ritual had transcended the physical. It now lived in memory, in thought, in perception. The more he performed, the more the chapel learned, evolved, and grew. The chanting escalated into a cacophony of overlapping voices. Some whispered his name. Others screamed in agony. Every sound resonated within him, embedding the feast into the very marrow of his existence. And the altar continued its grotesque dance. Limbs and organs moved with precision, creating shapes, symbols, and patterns that were impossible in nature, yet perfectly coherent in the rhythm of the feast. James was part of this orchestra now, every movement and thought feeding the chapel, ever-expanding consciousness. Time ceased to exist. James no longer measured hours or days. The chapel had become infinite. Its walls expanded and contracted, forming impossible geometries. The offerings multiplied, combining, splitting, and reshaping themselves in complex patterns. James' own body had fractured into multiple states. One part of him moved, performed, and created. Another part screamed silently. Another watched, detached yet fully aware. He realized with horror that the feast could fragment consciousness itself, turning participants into nodes in its symphony. The high priest approached, now ethereal, almost merging with the chapel itself. The feast is eternal. Every witness becomes a note, every movement a chord, every heartbeat a measure, and every measure echoes forever. James understood the final truth. He would never leave. He had become both audience and instrument, participant and offering. The chapel had claimed him entirely. He was infinite within the ritual. James knelt before the altar, completely absorbed. Candle flames flickered in impossible patterns, reflecting dozens of his own faces, all performing the ritual in perfect unison. The altar's offerings formed a grotesque cathedral of flesh and bone, spiraling upward, reaching the ceiling, and then twisting outward into the chapel itself. The chanting had become a living entity. It pulsed inside him, vibrating through every fiber of his being. Every note, every syllable, every breath of the cultists, of the chapel, and of James merged into one infinite, grotesque symphony. The high priest's voice came from every direction. Witness, instrument, ingredient. You are one with the feast. It never ends. It multiplies, it consumes, and it remembers. James closed his eyes. He felt the chapel envelop him entirely. Every heartbeat synced with the rhythm of the feast. Every movement, every thought, every tremor became part of the altar's eternal composition. And in that moment he understood. The feast would never stop. It would spread beyond the chapel, beyond the forest, into memory, thought, and perception. Every witness would add to it. Every participant would feed it. Every pulse, every breath, every heartbeat would echo in the symphony forever. The feast had begun its eternal cycle, and James Keller was its first note in a composition that would never end. The end.